Well, until we're able to get Joel on, maybe we can just hop right into it, and hopefully we're able to get him before we get too far into the panel. So for all in attendance here at the Hyper Automation, are the robots actually going to replace our jobs panel? Autonomous cars were imminent, then they weren't. AI was going to bring on a singularity, or was it? So we'll review research, trends, and lessons to arm you with understanding for your organization and your own job. So just to start us off, could our panelists sort of introduce themselves, sort of tell everyone where they're from and their experience with robotics and automation, and sort of one thing they're excited for when it comes to the future of automation? And we can start with Suzanne, who's on my left. I don't know how anybody else sees it. Or Susie. Joel, you're here. Just in time.
Hey, there's Joel. Yes.
Technically,
Hi, everyone.
a technical panel, and I was having technical problems. Go ahead, please start.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name's Susie Teal. For almost the past for my entire career, which spans decades, I've been in technology, primarily in software. But for almost the past 4 years, I've been involved at a national institute that some of you may have heard of called ARM, Advanced Robotics for Manufacturing. We're headquartered in Pittsburgh, and our mission is to use essentially federal dollars, we get them from the DoD, to fund projects to advance the state of robotics in manufacturing. And we do that through a member-based consortium. We've got about a little over 270 member organizations across the United States, and that spans manufacturers, large and small, robotics suppliers, from multinationals to startups. And as Pittsburgh has a large startup community, as Joel will share with us. Many of those organizations are members of ARM. Academic institutions, big research institutions like MIT and at CMU, all the way to community colleges and trade schools, and nonprofits that are focused on workforce development. So we all kind of come together and say, what can we do to improve the state and use of robots in the United States so that the United States can better take advantage of this technology and do more manufacturing in the United States. So that's our mission, and I'm the head of marketing of that organization. As I mentioned, have been involved there for almost 4 years.
Hi, my name's Alan Hester. I'm the president of a company called Nivitus, and our focus is on automation using a completely different kind of robot, software robots that automate tasks by interacting through the user interfaces of software in the same way that humans would do it. And my career, like Susie said, has been all in the technology space, with a specific focus on automation for about the past 5 years.
And Joel?
Okay, Dante, you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. So my name is Joel Reed. I'm currently serving as the executive director of the Pittsburgh Robotics Network. I've been in Pittsburgh for a little bit over 20 years in the tech community, and have actually worked for 3 robotics companies during that time. 2 of them were fully autonomous vehicles, but both were being deployed in warehousing and logistics environments. In fact, the one that I was working for, Seagrid Corporation, was one of the first fully autonomous vehicles really in the world. And at the time, there were only 2 automated solutions. One was Kiva and the other was Seagrid. And Kiva was acquired by Amazon and is now a part of moving a lot of the items that we receive at our houses every day. But Seagrid didn't require any infrastructure, so it was using cameras and algorithms to look around in the world. So I hope to talk a little bit about what's happening in Pittsburgh. There's an enormous concentration of robotics companies and autonomous technologies. I really believe that the center of the autonomous vehicle universe resides in Pittsburgh. We have 4 or 5 of the top research centers from Uber ATG, Argo AI, Aurora, Aptiv, and others that are popping up, a trucking company called Locomation, and they're popping up every day. So we have autonomous vehicles riding around the streets of Pittsburgh all the time. And it's a very exciting technology, and it's in a very exciting time to be involved with this. The PRN represents that community. And we really exist to make connections between all the development and the growth that's happening there and other sectors and markets and communities in the world. So we really appreciate this opportunity to tell you more.
So to start our panel off, we sort of have two views on the advancements of robotics and AI and machine learning. We have the techno optimist, sort of like the Wall-E perspective, the robots are going to help us be better humans. And then you have the Skynet dystopian view where like the AI is going to destroy us all. Can you guys sort of start with like outlining these two big views and sort of why they're both criticized? And we can start with you, Alan.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think through all of the different variations that this kind of topic can take you in a conversation. But what we have seen in my space, the usage of software robots to automate mundane human tasks. When it first started out, I think everyone was really screaming that the sky is falling, the robots are coming for our jobs, and there was a lot of panic. However, I think that as we have seen projects actually be implemented and realize the real ramifications that the bots have on the work done by humans, is that it's really deemed to be more of an advantage than a disadvantage now, once people really understand that the bots are really just taking things off of their plate that they don't want on there to begin with, right? It's not like a bot is coming in and taking wholesale jobs away from people. They're taking all of those stupid little tasks that you have to do that aren't really a requirement of your job, but somebody has to do them. Things where, you have to copy and paste something out of an email to put it into a different system, or you have to copy from one system to another system, or pull something out of a document that you need to use in some other way. All of these things that every one of us do every day that are just those repetitive, mind-numbing kind of tasks are the things that the bots can do for you. And I think once people realize that and they get to see how it impacts their jobs in a positive way, it actually ends up being a real driver for employee satisfaction in a lot of companies, because people are more engaged with their job. They're more excited to come to work because they're doing the things that they want to do and the things that they are best at.
Yeah, Dante, I'll add there's a term that's used in the industry. It's the 3Ds. So it's dull, dirty, and dangerous. And this is typically what machines have been designed to automate. In my last company, IM Robotics, we had a robot that was picking things that we might order online from warehouse shelves and fulfilling that in a warehouse fully autonomously. And the number that we used is that we predicted by next year that, now this was all pre-COVID, but COVID's actually accelerating the need in other ways. But pre-COVID, we were going to see a shortage of 1 million workers in the US alone to do these 3D jobs in logistics alone. And I'll throw out another stat, and this is very pertinent to what's happening today. If you look at the amount of time that we traditionally had spent in retail stores, going in, shopping, picking items off of the shelf, and then walking out with our bags, we were spending 40 billion hours a year as consumers doing that work. And it is work in the supply chain. Imagine, and pre-COVID, we were at about a 12 to 15% penetration rate of online sales. just imagine what has happened, in just the last 6 months alone. We're all staying home. So that has accelerated. And those shopping hours now have to be done in warehouses that have a shortage of workers. So this even gets beyond taking existing jobs. We're not going to be able to do the work that's needed in an economy that's shifting extremely rapidly.
And just to pick up on that point, everything that Alan and Joel have said is very much what we see every day at the ARM Institute. We always like to say that, automation's been around for at least 500 years. Queen Elizabeth lamented the invention of the spinning wheel because that took jobs away from women, right? And so we've been going through these periods of automation for forever, right? For as long as, humans have almost been around, that we've always looked at ways to be more productive and to take humans out of those situations where jobs are dull, dirty, and dangerous. And that's where we see a lot of the applicability, as Joel mentioned and Alan mentioned. There's also a lot of the dangerous types of jobs, right? There are companies out there like the Pittsburgh-based RE2, that it's helping the military find and defuse bombs, right? The work done at Carnegie Mellon University with the snake robot to go in and look for people in a natural disaster like an earthquake. I mean, there are just numerous examples of where robots are actually doing these jobs, helping to save lives or helping to prevent people from losing their lives or being injured. And I think that's really the key that we have to focus on, are those 3 Ds. I think one of the things, though, that causes this controversy, Dante, is, and this is something that we talk a lot about, is automation's always been around. But if you look at sort of the intersection between the pace of automation and the longevity of human life, what we're really seeing is that people's jobs are changing in their lifetime. And that is really the reason why we believe the reason why people are so nervous about robots and automation now. Because it used to be that our fathers or grandfathers would either go to college or they develop a skill as a tradesperson and they could do that job for the rest of their lives. That's not true anymore. We're going to live into our 80s or 90s. Our children may live into their hundreds. What they go to school for is not the job that they're going to be doing 20 or 30 years later. And so what we have is a real challenge from an education standpoint, where we don't have a lifelong learning model that allows people to easily adapt to using the type of software that Alan's creating, right? Because it takes away some of the dullness of the work, but creates new opportunities for them. We still have an education model that assumes that if you go to school to be an accountant, you'll be an accountant for the rest of your life using the same knowledge that you've got in those 4 years of education. So I think that conflict that we see between it's great and it's really scary is a result of those 2 factors.
Totally agree. And just a short joke here. I think for people that are afraid that robots are going to take over society, you can do 2 things. You either hit the e-stop button or you wait for their battery to run out, and then we'll be fine.
Exactly. They only do what we tell them to do.
That's exactly right.
So I guess, how do you tackle that transition? How do you sort of tackle the, new age that we're in, where automation is something that the generation coming up is just going to have to live with? That how do you sort of help people bridge that gap? Like, where?
I think the pandemic has actually been an interesting spark for this, because many companies now are faced with shortages of various types. Some companies have less employees available, people having to stay home to take care of their kids. Even if they're working at home, they might not be able to do as much work as they could do in their office, or maybe just not in the same way. And so I think what we are seeing is there's a big rush towards adoption of these automation technologies now by companies that had previously been only thinking about it. It's not that they were on the fence. I think many of these companies had decided that they wanted to go in this direction, but there was nothing really pushing them towards it. And the pandemic has really served as that spark to ignite their need to do this kind of thing for their company, especially companies that are really trying to scale and grow. This gives them the ability to not just fill the current needs, but look at ways that they can scale up their company without requiring them to add a huge amount of people to do it.
Yeah, and I agree completely, Alan. In fact, Joel was talking about 1 million jobs in logistics. There's going to be about 5 million jobs open in manufacturing in the United States. A report by Deloitte that came out in 2018 predicted. And so we are looking at an opportunity where we do want to do more manufacturing in the United States, but we don't have the people to do it, or they don't have the skills to do it. And so I really think kind of getting back to the point of lifelong learning and continue. Well, first of all, I would say the new generation, the generation coming up, already feels comfortable with technology. So that's a big win right there, right? I mean, they get phones now when they're 7 or 8 years old. They're using a very sophisticated computer when they're very young, right, as a child. And so they feel very comfortable with technology. I think the issue is that we've got to better create the connection between these jobs as interesting and exciting jobs working with robots, given the fact that they are using technology today anyways, right? And I think, unfortunately, a lot of what's shown in the media is very negative about robots, right? Either the people working with them are, nerdy people that don't, have a social life, right? We see that in the media, or the robots are out to destroy the world. So there's a very distorted view of the value of robots that the media projects today that I know we work hard to overcome. Joel, through the PRN, works hard to overcome. And I think that's a big challenge until we get people realizing that working with robots is cool because they've been working with technology all this time anyways. We're going to continue to have these shortages, and we're going to continue to have this perception that robots are bad.
Yeah, and I'll just add that we probably need to see the creation and growth of trade schools dedicated to these future jobs. A lot of this is being driven by PhDs today, but a fair bit of the manufacturing, assembly, maintenance, and support of, let's just call them machines. Let's get away from the word robot, which has this sci-fi feeling to it. Actually requires a new set of integrated skills. So I'd like to see the development of more trade schools and programs around it.
And Joel just gave me a good plug I have to take, but on that note, ARM is launching in Q1 of 2021, and you can go look at it now at a new website called roboticscareer.org, which will list thousands of programs that are available in the United States to develop the skills to work in robots, not from necessarily as much from a PhD perspective. Those programs will be listed, but also from a technician perspective. So if you can kind of bookmark roboticscareer.org and go take a look at it when it's live next year, that we hope that will help solve that problem.
One of the really interesting dynamics that we see happening is that the software robots that we are making actually help to bridge the gap between people and technology in some very interesting ways. Many of the highly technical skills that were required and still are required a lot of specialized training. If you think about what it takes to become a programmer so that you can integrate different systems or build some kind of custom software, that generally takes a whole lot of knowledge and education in order to do that kind of work. And yet using the software robots, you can do similar things without that level of training. So it makes it accessible to someone who really understands their business processes very well, and they're a little bit tech savvy about the level that you need to be able to do a complicated Microsoft Excel spreadsheet is really all you need in order to build automations using these software robots.
And I guess to talk a bit more about that paradigm of like robots sort of having that negative light and automation sort of have that negative light. Could you guys talk a bit more about, I guess, the 3Ds that most people use robots for, like dirty, dull, and dangerous, and sort of talk about more examples of how automation supports professionals rather than replaces them?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start brainstorming a couple. You know, in the logistics space, so we're accustomed now to ordering things online. We now do it every day or multiple times in a day. Unfortunately, I'm getting packages with one item in a box, but multiple boxes. So somebody actually has to walk into a warehouse and up and down aisles to find that single item. No longer are they moving pallets of goods. You know, a typical worker, and I hope I get this right, can walk 6 to 10 miles a day in a warehouse. And when they're going from point A to point B, they're not using their intellectual skills. They're not using their creativity or problem skills. All they're simply doing is walking. And a lot of these people are working, you know, from 11 p.m. till 7 in the morning. So they're almost robotic in some ways, you know, and those jobs have extremely high turnover rates. People don't actually like them, and they move around for very small changes, you know, in compensation, and they're not highly compensated. Mining applications, humans having to go into dangerous mine conditions and do exploration, initial exploration, and scanning and to set up an operation. That's an extremely dangerous job. But if you can send an autonomous robot in there to do the initial scanning, remediation of sewer lines, that is a really shitty job. Right? I mean, literally, it's a shitty job. So, excuse me. I'm sure this audience will appreciate that. And again, that's a very dull and dirty and dangerous job, you know, for an individual to do. So you can have a higher level of skill to understand the task that needs to be done, and you allow the machine to do a lot of this work. And Susie mentioned it. There are plenty of examples of machines that are not called robots that do these things for us right now. You know, we mow our lawns with powered motors that have automated drives on them, you know, so we should be accustomed to machinery being a part of our life.
And we've got, I mean, to build upon what Joel said, ARM's funded to date in our almost 4 years of life over 70 projects that focus specifically on those issues. So doing jobs like refinishing helicopter blades and airport airline wings, right? And again, you know, those have to be done very well. And if you know the helicopter could drop, right, if the blades are not finished the exact same way. So who wants to be in a room where you're sanding and refinishing large helicopter blades, right? That's a dull and dirty and dangerous job. Those are the types of projects we're funding. Assembling wire harnesses. Wire harnesses are all the wires that connect all the different components that allow any device to work. They're in cars, they're in everything. A very tedious job where people are holding their hands up and taking all these wires and then putting them together, right, so that they can live in the chassis of a car or an airplane or something else. We're funding projects where robots can do the assembly of those wire harnesses. Again, dull, dirty, dangerous job. And I can just go on and on and on. And so that's really where we see that huge impact. Then the humans, like Alan talks about, can use their brains to figure out what's the best way to solve these bigger problems and bring robots into the picture, as opposed to doing that robotic task. And so, I mean, there's numerous examples of ways that our lives are better because robots are doing these things that are very tedious or very dangerous.
And Susie, if I can, I want to add, not only are we looking at, jobs that are, dull, dangerous, and dirty, but we're enabling new capabilities and creating new capacity for society. Look at agricultural technologies.
So I was going to bring that one up next. Yep.
Yeah, so we have a company called Fifth Season that's doing vertical farming in urban environments. And it's able to take the footprint of 4 to 5 farms and put it into a single footprint. And so, we're going to have a problem feeding the world and doing it economically and from a healthy standpoint. And it's taking
with climate change issues, right?
And with climate change issues. So, right. So technology that's not even about jobs. That's just about improving society.
So in our case, we're not talking about dirty and dangerous jobs typically, because usually it's just someone sitting at a keyboard. So dull is definitely relevant. And for us, I think the reason why that is important, it's not just a factor for the person who's doing the work, but for some of these repetitive, dull tasks, if you're put in a position where you have to do them over and over again, you may stop paying as close attention on the 1,000th time doing something as compared to the first. And when you get a bot to do that work, it doesn't care if it's the first time it's done it or the millionth time it's done it. It's going to do it the same way every single time and never need a break, and also will work 24/7. So obviously there's huge advantages both to the people that don't have to do these boring tasks anymore, but also to the company in terms of productivity as well as lower defect rates.
And I'm going to take a question from the audience, and this one is for you, Alan. The pandemic made companies quickly adapt the automation to deal with disruption. At the enterprise level, how will adoption change in 2021 and beyond?
Yeah, I think we already talked a little bit about that, but I think really it's accelerating everything. I think people who were on the fence now are off the fence, because they realize that these are the things that they have to think through in order to keep their businesses viable and competitive going forward. These kinds of technologies that I think for the past several years have been considered the things that only the biggest companies can think about, now are accessible to very small companies. The cost of the technology has come down. The complexity and the knowledge that it takes to implement them has come down significantly. So I think it's at the point now where even very small companies can make very significant improvements to their bottom line by leveraging these technologies. And I think we're only going to see that increase year over year.
And I guess to talk a bit more about sort of that cycle of, I guess, autonomous things being really big, say like autonomous vehicles. There was a time where people thought it was going to be the next thing, and there was a story every other day about whether things were going right with autonomous vehicles, and maybe we have a future where the trucks taking goods from place to place would drive themselves, and then the next day it's not something that you hear about much anymore. I guess, could you talk a bit about how technologies that remain harder to implement than the wider public thinks, and how does that play into the fear and hope of these technologies becoming more widespread?
I can start off if everybody doesn't mind. So I really appreciate this question, and took some time to think about it. It's very interesting, and we probably can kick off a whole nother session on this topic alone. So if you think about the adoption rate of technologies and products, they have been increasing exponentially over the last 50 to 100 years. The time it took to reach a certain number of users for the radio, for the television, for Google and the internet, and then ultimately Facebook and tomorrow's app, which will have 1 million users within a couple weeks, it has kind of distorted our expectation for how long things should take. When I was looking back at Pittsburgh's history, it was remarkable to me that it actually took about 100 years for the steel industry to take root. The raw resource was available in the 1700s. The processes and the technologies existed, but there wasn't a market. And interestingly, there wasn't a market until we had a civil war, in the United States. And then we decided to expand our railroad system westward. Then we had a market and a need for steel. Autonomous vehicles, autonomous technology is extremely difficult. I'm a salesperson, so I do appreciate the marketing angle on all of this. And I'm also a techno optimist, and I'm an entrepreneur. So I have to think this way. I have to believe in the rocket curve, to a business. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing it. But you have to be pragmatic about the technology as well. And, 7 years ago, myself and some colleagues were having conversations about the autonomous vehicle. And some people are like, oh, it's going so fast, and, crowdsourcing and we'll have it in 2 years. And most of us thought that we were probably 15 to 20 years off. And you're actually starting to get the leaders of the autonomous vehicle companies coming out with some more reasonable statements. And they've created this hierarchy of, level 1 through 5 of autonomy. And we're probably in about level 3 right now, creeping into it. Some companies are trying to get into level 4. And it's just extremely difficult. And I'll leave you with this. Like, I've had the chance to drive in a Tesla recently. And I got to tell you, I personally, and I'm in the industry, I'm not ready to let this machine drive me down the highway at 80 miles an hour and take a nap. There's still a lot that's got to happen in the industry for that to be very reliable.
And just to pick up on Joel's point, which I agree with also, I think we find ourselves in a position because so many of these companies need funding, right? Venture funding or other sources of funding, that you have a period of hype at the very beginning because you're trying to attract investors. And so what happens is you go through this big period of hype where this is the next thing, this is going to solve all these problems. But like Joel said, these problems are very complicated and hard to solve. To me, it's very similar to the pharmaceutical industry, right? And what we're looking at, if you just use an example today with COVID and a vaccine, we know vaccine development takes time, right? And it's a very complex project, and there's a lot of pieces and components that are involved with it until you actually have a vaccine that's safe. And that could be years and years of work, right? We hope it's not, right, in this particular case, but it could be. It's the same thing when you're dealing with a very sophisticated piece of equipment that we want to be autonomous. You have to think of every situation that those components, those hardware and software components working together, talking to other hardware and software components, have to get right. And so I think that's what happens is we've got this initial hype cycle to raise the money. They get a bunch of money, whether it's millions, hundreds of millions, or billions, as we've seen poured into the autonomous vehicle industry. But then they've got to go away and solve all those really, really hard problems about what do you do in this scenario or that scenario, which the human brain is equipped to do very well.
But the investment is worthwhile, and it can be validated because or justified because new markets are coming out of this. New technologies are being created, and new companies, even like Allen's. These are necessary technologies. So we're putting the ecosystem together. We're defining all the components and suppliers that are going to be needed, and the supporting, vendors in place. These new driver assist technologies, they are very useful to us, and they are changing, our habits and our capabilities as a society. So there is a lot of market value to be generated along this journey. So, the billions of dollars that are going in these companies today are highly justified.
Yeah.
Well,
absolutely.
I think this is the point where really the hardware and software sides come together, because the driver in both cases really is the advancement of artificial intelligence. And I think as we go further and further down the road and we see more advances made, we're going to see more possibilities both on the hardware side in terms of capabilities, and on the software side, the big driver is with exception handling, right? It's very easy for us to automate a process and say, anytime you run into a problem, talk to this person about it and they will help you resolve it. And as artificial intelligence technologies get more capable and more advanced, the number of times that a bot has to ask a human for help is going to be reduced to the point where the bots are able to do most of the work on their own. And I think, you know, we're seeing huge advances in this technology every day. And I think that is going to just continue to cause this whole sector to explode, really.
And let me, I also want to share, since, you know, we're talking to a localized audience mostly, a lot of this development and advancement in the industry is happening here. It's happening in Pennsylvania. It's happening in Philadelphia. It's most undoubtedly happening in Pittsburgh, you know, because of our autonomous, you know, routes. And so all of this connectivity and enabling technology, interestingly, is not being concentrated and isolated on the coasts this time around. So and that's just, you know, I don't know if that's because of, you know, our digital connectivity. We didn't travel together, you know, to have this session. Now we're working from home more than ever because of the current crisis. But universities, you know, like Penn and CMU, University of Pittsburgh, even MIT and Boston, you know, are driving the development in some new geographical areas. And that's very exciting. And that's led to over 100 companies in Pittsburgh alone that are focusing on robotic development.
And I guess in that term of just like automation and, you know, where the human skill and the automation sort of intersect, I guess, how do you identify human skills that are not only likelier to remain relevant longer, but continue to be valued? Is that something that people who work in autonomous fields and machines sort of think about?
Absolutely. We've gone through and actually identified those essential skills that we call them the soft skills that are really critical moving forward. And I know there was a question that came up through the chat about that the essential skills that we look at are things like problem solving, flexibility, you know, adapting to change easily, comfortable working in teams. And those skills, I mean, those are skills, honestly, that employers value anyways, right, for the most part, but they're really, really important for the jobs, for, you know, whether you're building robots or whether you're using robots. Those skills are really important. And we talk, if you go to our website, we talk about those a lot, those essential soft skills that are needed. And I think, you know, I think you guys are all familiar with Peter Drucker, right? One of the management gurus, he always talked about the knowledge worker. And the knowledge worker is even more prevalent today. I mean, the person who can assess the situation and figure out how to best resolve that situation, and what, you know, where humans need to be involved and where machines or robots or AI can be involved, is going to be a critical skill moving forward. And then being able to actually use that equipment is going to be a really, really critical skill moving forward as well.
I think that actually brings up an interesting point that ties into something that we mentioned earlier, which is how people get educated for these kinds of jobs. But this is an interesting twist on it, because the things that are likely to stay important parts of humans' jobs are things that aren't generally taught in schools. So exactly. All of that deep thought and problem solving ability and leadership and all the nuances of human and social interaction, these are things that aren't really taught. I think it's because our educational system was largely built in a time where people were going to work in factories and they were doing these repetitive, mundane tasks, that we're teaching our kids to do things with that kind of a mindset. And I think we need to kind of take a step back and analyze what and how we're teaching them, in a way that it's going to be useful to all of us in the future.
Yeah, I mean, my academic friends, anybody who's an academic, my apologies up front, but that model of you graduate from high school and go to school for 4 years and have a career for the rest of your life just doesn't work anymore. It just doesn't work. We have to look at a way where maybe you engage with a university like, Penn or CMU, or a state school, right, like Lock Haven or IUP for your entire career. Right. And maybe you go for a year and you go do some work, and then you go back 10 years later and you get some additional skills development because your job has changed. And so I think there's going to be a real, I don't know how long it's going to take. And it's hard to undo a model that's been around for hundreds of years. But I think, we have to adopt a model of lifelong learning and an expectation that you're not going to be in the same job that you graduate from some higher education program for forever. It's not going to be feasible. And the sooner we realize that as a country and start to adopt and change the education model, the better off we're all going to be.
Dante, I'm not sure if you're going to touch on it, but I see we might be finishing soon. I see the question about inequality and diversity, being in this industry. And it's such an important topic. And I'm not sure I have, an answer about the inequality and how automation is going to impact it. I think it's okay to think that it's going to worsen because of the march towards automation. But one thing that this new industry is doing is it's creating the need for a more skilled worker. Those skilled workers, even on the lower levels of compensation, will be earning more generally across society. And we still need mechanics to work on hardware, but they also need to be able to access a command line and get to some simple instructions, on those machines. So I think that could be one way that will be helpful. Ultimately, and I think this has always been the case, this is really a cultural and societal issue, and we have to figure out how to address inequality as we continue to change the tools that we have, as a society. But I'm curious to hear from the others as well, because I don't think it's I don't think that we've really solved it yet.
Yeah, interestingly, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, just real quickly, one of the things that we have been focused on is trying to apply some projects towards underrepresented people, right? And so we do have projects that we funded where they're developing robotic skills, people who are recently, people that were incarcerated that are back out into society, single mothers, right, trying to raise their children, veterans, people who are physically disabled. The nice thing about robots is that it doesn't really care, right, about any of those things, right? So anybody can develop those skills to work with robots. And so I think that the robots actually will, over time, allow people potentially with physical disabilities or others that may not have been able to stand on that, on that production line, right, as a manufacturing job, to actually have a manufacturing job. And so it's very early, but we are still we're seeing some movement towards robots helping to bring those underrepresented populations into the workforce.
And I think on our side, the impact is almost exactly opposite of what you guys are describing, because what we have happening is taking highly technical jobs and making it more accessible to less technical people with a lower amount of training. So people who have been doing administrative type work are now able to do much more complicated technical tasks because of the assistance of the bots. So we have a little bit of a disparity there, I guess, between the hardware and software sides of looking at robots.
Well, I think robots are, one of our goals is to make robots easier to use. And so most of the skills development of people are looking at going through a trade program that's just a few weeks long. And so I agree with you somewhat, Alan, if you're certainly on the side where you're creating and assembling and programming robots and integrating them into your environment. There's a certain skill level that you would need there. But if you're actually the person managing the robot, that actually can be someone who can come right out of high school to do that, or a short trade school program to do that. They don't have to go to college for 4 years and incur the cost of that in order to have that type of job. So I think there's a mix of both.
So we're at about 11:46, and I do want to thank you guys for taking the time to conduct this panel, and specifically for even addressing the issues of inequalities in this industry. And again, thank you everyone for coming to the panel, and thank you for sharing your expertise.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Dante.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Alan, Susie.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.